What if everything you've been told about winning a war is wrong, and right now, as you watch global tensions rise, you're witnessing a conflict where the side taking the damage might not be the one losing? Turn on the news and the pattern feels familiar. Airstrikes, destroyed facilities, rising casualties, leaders declaring strength while cities brace for impact. It looks like power is being exercised decisively, like the stronger side is doing exactly what it's supposed to do: strike hard, degrade the enemy, enforce an outcome. But here's the problem: no one wants to say out loud. In modern geopolitics, destruction is no longer proof of victory. In fact, it can be part of someone else's strategy, because while one side is measuring success by what it can eliminate, the other is measuring success by something far more unsettling: whether it can survive, absorb, and extend the conflict just long enough to change the entire game. And if you think that sounds abstract, look closer at what's happening right now between the United States, Israel, and Iran. On the surface, it looks like overwhelming force meeting a weaker opponent. But beneath that surface is a completely different kind of war, one that isn't decided by who strikes harder, but by who controls the timeline. So before you decide who's winning, you need to ask a much more dangerous question. What if the real battlefield isn't where the bombs are falling, but in how long the war is allowed to continue? Now let's ground this in what you're actually seeing, because at first glance, the conclusion feels obvious. Precision strikes hit critical infrastructure, military assets are degraded, key figures are removed, and headlines frame it as a clear demonstration of dominance. This is the version of reality most people accept without question. The stronger power acts. The weaker side absorbs the damage, and the outcome seems predetermined, but then something doesn't add up. The system that was supposed to collapse doesn't. The leadership remains. The structure holds. The internal narrative doesn't fracture under pressure. It tightens. And that's the first signal that what you're watching isn't a traditional victory unfolding in real time. Because if overwhelming force was supposed to produce a decisive outcome, why does the opponent still exist as a functioning actor? Why does the conflict feel unresolved even after significant damage has already been done? This is where the illusion begins to crack. Because modern conflict is no longer defined by how much you can destroy, but by whether destruction actually achieves the outcome you intended. And if it doesn't, then what you're looking at isn't victory. It's the beginning of something much more complicated. The reason this feels confusing is because most people assume both sides are playing the same game, following the same logic, chasing the same definition of success. They are not. The United States enters conflicts with a clear expectation: apply overwhelming pressure, eliminate the threat, stabilize the situation, and move forward. It is a model built on speed, clarity, and final outcomes. But Iran operates on a completely different set of rules. It does not need a clean victory. It does not need to overpower its opponent. Its objective is far more strategic and far more patient. Iran's goal is to ensure that no matter how much force is applied against it, the conflict never truly resolves in favor of its opponent. Because once a war cannot be cleanly finished, it stops being a battlefield problem and becomes a long-term strategic burden. And this is where the dynamic shifts, because a power that wants to end the conflict quickly is now forced into a game defined by duration, uncertainty, and constant pressure. This is not a clash of strength. It is a clash of timelines. For decades, Iran has been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation, not by trying to match military strength head on, but by building a system designed to stretch any conflict far beyond its original scope. Instead of relying on a single front, it operates across multiple layers of influence, creating pressure points that can be activated over time. The objective is not to defeat the United States in a direct confrontation that would be unrealistic. The objective is to make sure the United States is never able to fully disengage never able to shift its focus entirely elsewhere, and never able to declare the situation resolved. Every escalation becomes another thread tying the conflict together. Every response creates another obligation, and slowly, the situation transforms from a short-term operation into a long-term commitment. This is not about winning quickly. It is about ensuring the other side cannot walk away. And once a superpower is locked into a conflict, it cannot cleanly exit. The balance of power starts to look very different than it did at the beginning. Now, this is where the turning point begins to emerge. Because in a traditional war, this level of damage would signal the beginning of the end. Infrastructure is hit, capabilities are reduced, and momentum is supposed to shift decisively toward the stronger side. But instead of collapsing, the system absorbs the udar and adjusts. The response is not chaotic, it is calculated. Escalation happens in controlled bursts. Restraint appears at unexpected moments, and the pace of the conflict becomes deliberately uneven. This is not what defeat looks like. This is what adaptation looks like. And once a conflict stops following the script of rapid resolution, it enters a far more dangerous phase one, where outcomes are no longer tied to immediate events, but to how long each side can sustain pressure. Because if the war doesn't end when it's supposed to, then every additional day becomes a strategic shift, not just a continuation. And that's the moment where perceived victory starts to lose its meaning. To understand where the real leverage lies, you have to stop focusing on the explosions and start paying attention to the systems that keep the world running. Energy flows, shipping lanes, supply chains. These are the foundations of modern power. And at the center of this system sits one of the most critical choke points on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz. A narrow stretch of water, yet responsible for a massive share of global oil and energy movement. Control here isn't just geographic, it's economic and psychological. Because when this corridor is threatened, the impact is immediate and global. Prices surge. Markets react. Governments feel pressure, and ordinary people begin to notice it in their daily lives. Iran does not need to dominate the battlefield if it can influence this artery, because the moment energy becomes unstable, the conflict stops being regional. It becomes personal for millions of people who suddenly find themselves paying the cost. And this is where the real condition for victory changes, because a decisive win ends a war, but an unresolved conflict extends influence. As long as tension remains, as long as escalation is always one step away, the pressure never disappears. The stronger power is forced to stay engaged, to commit more resources, to maintain presence, to manage risk that never fully goes away. Over time, the cost begins to shift. It is no longer just about military operations. It becomes economic strain, political pressure, and strategic distraction. And that is the battlefield that matters most. Not territory, not a single strike, but time itself. Because when a conflict cannot be cleanly finished, and the question is no longer who is stronger, it becomes who can endure longer without breaking their own system. And once the war is defined that way, the advantage is no longer as clear as it once seemed. But beneath all of this strategy, all of this calculation, there is a layer that rarely gets the attention it deserves, the human cost. Because while governments measure outcomes in leverage and positioning, ordinary people experience these conflicts in a completely different way. Families are forced to leave their homes with no certainty of return. Cities that once felt stable become places of fear and unpredictability. Lives are interrupted. Not in theory, but in real, irreversible ways. And this is where the narrative becomes uncomfortable. Because no matter how you define victory at the strategic level, the consequences on the ground do not disappear. They accumulate, they linger, they reshape entire generations. This is the part that challenges the idea of winning altogether. Because if survival at the state level comes at the cost of long-term instability for millions of people, then what exactly is being preserved and for whom? And yet, Despite this reality, the machinery of geopolitics continues to move forward, driven not by emotion, but by objectives that rarely align with the lives most affected by them. And the impact of a conflict like this does not stay contained within its borders. It sends a signal far beyond the region itself. Other nations are watching closely, not just to see who strikes harder, but to understand what actually happens when a smaller power withstands sustained pressure from a much stronger one. Because in geopolitics, perception becomes precedent. If a country can absorb significant force and continue functioning, that changes how others calculate risk. It alters the assumptions that have guided global power for decades. Allies begin to question reliability. Rivals begin to reassess their own strategies. Neutral states begin to reconsider where they stand. And slowly, without a single formal declaration, the balance of confidence in the international system begins to shift. This is not about a single conflict anymore. It becomes a reference point, a case study that influences decisions in places far removed from the original battlefield. So now you have to step back and ask the question that cuts through all the noise, all the headlines, all the immediate reactions. Whose objectives are actually being achieved? Because in modern conflict, that is the only metric that matters. Did the stronger power fully eliminate the threat it set out to remove? Did it reduce its long-term involvement, stabilize the region, and create a clear endpoint? Or did it find itself more deeply tied to a situation that refuses to resolve cleanly? And on the other side, did the weaker power survive the confrontation? Did it maintain its core structure and preserve its ability to exert influence where it matters most? If those answers are not clearly in favor of one side, then the outcome itself is not as straightforward as it appears. And once you reach that realization, the idea of victory begins to shift from something visible and immediate to something far more complex and far more difficult to define. This is the mindset shift you cannot ignore, because once you see it, you cannot go back to the old way of thinking. Winning in modern geopolitics is no longer about dominance, and it is no longer about who can inflict the most damage in the shortest amount of time. It is about alignment between strategy and outcome, between intention and reality. A stronger power can win every exchange on the battlefield and still fail to achieve its long-term objective. A weaker power can absorb loss after loss and still succeed by preventing that objective from ever being realized. That is the uncomfortable truth, because it means power alone is no longer enough. Endurance, positioning, and the ability to shape time itself have become just as important, if not more. And once a conflict shifts into that dimension, the definition of victory becomes unstable. It is no longer a moment you can point to. It is a process that unfolds slowly, often without a clear conclusion. And in that kind of war, the question is not who is stronger, but who can sustain their strategy without breaking under the weight of their own commitments. So when you step back and look at everything we've just walked through, the picture becomes much clearer, and at the same time, far more unsettling. This is not a story about one side clearly winning and the other clearly losing. It is a story about a conflict where destruction does not automatically lead to victory, where survival itself can be interpreted as success, and where the longer the war continues, the more the balance begins to shift in ways that are not immediately visible. And if there is one thing you should take away from this, it is this: the most dangerous conflicts today are not the ones that end quickly, but the ones that never truly end at all. If this perspective changed the way you see what's happening right now, then this is exactly the kind of insight you need to hold on to. Save this video, because you will want to come back to it as events continue to unfold. And if you want to stay ahead of the next shift, the next escalation, the next hidden layer behind global conflicts, make sure you subscribe, because this is where we break down not just what is happening, but what it actually means. And despite how complex and uncertain all of this may feel, there is still one thing worth holding on to. The more clearly you understand the world, the less likely you are to be controlled by fear of it.